Hi, this is Carol from Sharity, and thanks for joining me today for landing that major gift in 2021. This webinar is specifically dedicated to domestic violence organizations. I spent over a decade of my life working with women who had suffered from abuse, either when I was a CEO of a domestic violence organization, or prior to that, I spent 20 years working with abused children and girls. And one thing that I learned, which I'm sure many of you have, is I learned how to fundraise, not because I went to training classes, although I attended a few, but because I had to. If we didn't fundraise, we didn't keep our doors open. And unfortunately, most of the time, I didn't have fundraising staff. I didn't have a big team. I didn't have marketing professionals. It was me. And so I had to figure it out on my own. Well, in this day and age, we don't have time to figure it out on our own. And so I'm going to teach you today the basics of how you can start to land major gifts based on my 30 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, but also based on my experience as a consultant on the other side of the desk. I've learned some tricks that I wish I had known 20 years ago, and I'm going to share them with you today. So the first thing that we're going to do today is really start to talk about the things that philanthropists look for when they're thinking about making a major investment. So tell me, have you ever asked yourself, why do we always get passed over? I mean, we've got a great organization. We are a wonderful, important component of our community. Why is it that we seem to get passed over year over year and other nonprofits seem to always get the major donations? Or maybe you ask, why isn't that some of my board members don't give? Or maybe they give, but you know they have the capacity to give a lot of money. Maybe they give $10,000 a year to the symphony and they write you a $500 check. And while you're grateful for that 500, you can't figure out why is it that they're not giving us the major gift when they sit on our board. And another question you may have asked yourself is, how is it that we can be so well respected and yet we never seem to get ahead? And for many organizations that deal with critical issues like violence against women, that's one that seems to stump a lot of people. Well, I can tell you the reason that you don't get ahead is not because you're not doing good work and that you're not because you aren't doing important work. It's because you're missing some of the components that investors feel are necessary in order to give you a lot of money. So one of the things that you need to know is that you're already behind the 8 ball. In fact, giving to women and girls is just 1.6 of the nearly $500 billion that's given to nonprofit causes in the United States every single year. And what's worse is that organizations that deal with violence against women get only 0.2% of that. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of all of the philanthropic giving. And why is that? Well, again, from having been in the field for a long time, having to fundraise and knowing how I shifted my fundraising from literally scraping by and reusing foam boards that we used for signs as bulletin boards in the classroom, I know now that being able to have the components to present to donors that they want to see is the difference. And it's not a matter of having violence against women take more money from other programs that are doing the same work. We really need to be expanding that so that giving to women and girls starts to encompass a much larger percentage of all philanthropic giving. And COVID has changed things. A lot of domestic violence organizations relied heavily on special events, and they weren't necessarily very tech savvy and not online. I mean, let's face it, the history of the domestic violence movement is to be very isolated. We've tried to hide ourselves and keep ourselves out of the limelight, and that's not necessarily done things for us in terms of fundraising and brand awareness. We don't have organizations where you can have tours and where you can have lots of volunteers come in and work with our clients. We can't bring our clients out and have them get up and speak in public. It's just not safe. And so when COVID came along, and all of a sudden 90% of domestic violence organizations in the United States had to cancel special events. They were already struggling with the impact of COVID in terms of social distancing in the shelter, making sure that infection rates didn't hit and wipe out staff and clients. Many had to cut back on services that were not ready or even remotely prepared to go into a telehealth sort of format. 13% ended up laying off staff. But what's even more concerning is that many of those organizations, after having canceled their October events, their spring event, and then their most critical October events, they were dipping into reserves. And we all know that many organizations rely on government funding, which has to be spent and then reimbursed. Those reserves are critical for the cash flow. You have to have money in the bank so that you can pay out the payroll, you can buy the goods, pay for the services, send in the invoice, and then being reimbursed for all of that. So if you don't have at least 3 months of reserves, that cash flow can get really, really tricky. Well, 50%, worse in the rural areas than in urban, but still around 50% of all domestic violence shelters had dropped into that red zone of less than 3 months of reserves during the pandemic. That means that we are looking at a lot of them really struggling to keep their doors open in 2021, especially if they're not able to shift and adjust to the new way of raising money, or really not even a new way. What we want to know is, how can you be one of those organizations that could be vetted by a McKinsey Scott and get tens of millions of dollars? McKinsey Scott just recently gave away $10 billion. None of it went to a domestic violence or sexual violence program in the United States. And why is that? Well, we aren't really sure, but what we do know is that she heavily vetted these organizations prior to giving them multi-million-dollar gifts without really their knowledge that it was going to happen. And these gifts are unallocated. This is a game changer for philanthropy, and I think many philanthropists will follow in her path. But what it means for you as an organization is that if you can't pass the vetting process, and I suspect most domestic violence and sexual violence organizations cannot pass the vetting process, you are going to be overlooked by this type of philanthropic gift, but also gifts from like philanthropists who are on your board, who choose to give their money to other organizations rather than to you. So ask yourself, what is Ms. Kenzie Scott looking for? And do I have all of those components present so that she could vet my organization and I could land that multi-million-dollar life-changing gift to work toward the mission? So we're going to go through, what does McKinsey Scott and other philanthropists look for? Well, there are 5 basic components. Most consultants will not necessarily lay these out that they're looking for these components, but I'm a research person. And so when I started going into the consulting field, I really started to look hard at what are the components that the people that I worked with needed to have going on in their organization for them to be successful. And I was really fortunate to be able to spend 2 years in a CEO roundtable when I was a nonprofit CEO working on earned revenue streams and social enterprises. And all of my counterparts in this roundtable were for-profit entrepreneurs. And I learned all about pitch decks and pro formas and all of the things that they had to have present in their companies in order to go to a venture capitalist. And I thought, it's exactly the same thing when I go to a donor. So I started making sure that all of those components were present in my nonprofit. And that's how I was able to raise $120 million through grants, major gifts, and even huge in-kind donations. I started putting the pieces together though when I became a consultant, and I saw organizations spending 10, 20, sometimes even $50,000 for feasibility studies only to have that study come back and say that they weren't ready to fundraise. And I thought, what if we could just tell the nonprofits in advance, these are the components you have to have, or this isn't going to be successful before they spend all of that money. Well, that's not the brightest way to make a ton of money as a capital campaign consultant, but it's something I'm really passionate about, making sure that nonprofits understand the basic components. And when you go to those fundraising conferences, they don't teach this. They teach basic things like how to write a case for support, or how to do an ask, or how to develop a strategic plan. But honestly, these are the components that you have to have in place in order to really be successful. And we're going to go through each one of them today fairly briefly, but I'm going to go over them to make sure you have what you need to have a Miss Kenzie Scott take a second look at your organization. And the first one is, do you have a well-articulated plan? Now, when we went out and asked domestic violence programs, did they have a plan? 56% of them said, no, we don't even have a plan at all. There's nothing on the books. We don't have any strategy for where we're going. We're just living day to day. Well, I can tell you, no one is going to give you a major gift if you don't even know where you're going. Why would they give you tens of millions of dollars, even $5,000, if you don't know where you're taking it, where you're going to go, and what you're going to do? Think about that venture capitalist again. If he's got an entrepreneur coming to him, an Elon Musk or someone like that, and they're saying they've got this brilliant plan, or they want money, they better be able to show a plan of what they're going to do with that money. So do you have a plan? Well, 44% said yes, but my guess is they don't have the right kind of plan. So ask yourself, what kind of plan do you have? Is it an inward-facing operational plan? And this is how you'll know if it's inward-facing. Many of you, and I've had them in my past, will have plans that look like this. They might start with a SWOT analysis, and they're going to have stakeholders and external and internal threats. They're going to do mission, vision, strategic priorities, goals, strategies, action plans. They might even have who's responsible, but it's not something that you would take out and show a donor. You might attach it to a grant because you're required to attach it to a grant, but honestly, how many of these just sit on a shelf and you take it out once a year to see whether or not you're actually making progress? I kind of think about these as bumper rails when you go bowling. That's what this is. This is an inward-facing operational plan to help you kind of fix some of the things internally. Not that these are bad, but this isn't going to help you raise money. What's going to help you raise money is an externally facing vision plan. Now, what does that look like? An externally facing vision plan is completely different. It starts out by talking to your donor about what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And most of us could say, well, obviously we're trying to solve the problem of domestic violence. But what is it about right now that you're trying to solve? Nobody's going to believe that your individual nonprofit is going to solve the problem of domestic violence. So the question is, what is it that you are doing, your organization is going to try to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years that's going to make a meaningful impact in the lives of your clients and in your community? That's the problem that you're trying to solve. You need to probably have a very clearly defined geographical focus. You need to be able to talk about what you're going to do. And most importantly, how will you know you're successful? So do you have an inwardly facing operational plan, an external facing vision plan, or no plan at all? That's step number one, is to get a plan. Step number two is a budget. Now that might seem, kind of silly. Well, of course we have a budget, but are you one of those organizations that has a July to June fiscal year, and about April, you build a budget, you present it to your board for approval in May, and then you put it into your computer system, so July 1, you have your budget? If you're one of those organizations, then donors are going to look at you and say, we have this really great plan, but how do we know how much it's going to cost? You need to have a 3-year pro forma. So what do I mean by that? That means you need to have a budget that has year 1, year 2, and year 3 all together that says, okay, if we need to be here by 2024, then year 1, this is what it's going to cost us to get there. Year 2, we're going to have to grow a little bit. And by year 3, this is where our operating budget's going to be. So when I add all 3 of those together, I know how much my operating expenses are going to be over the next 3 years. And I need to make sure that that budget shows the true cost of doing business. Does it include volunteer labor, in-kind goods, all of the things that we get for free that if they go away because of, say, a pandemic, we know what it's going to cost to replace those goods and services. The other thing we need to know is, of course, it's got to cover the entire period, but what is the replacement value of staff? Honestly, if you're an executive director and you left tomorrow, could your board replace you for what they're paying you right now? And can we, in fact, have our staff at the wages that they're at? And I want to take a moment and pause about this, because as you're doing this plan, I want to challenge all of you. A lot of times we pay our advocates who are answering the hotline or working in our shelters barely above minimum wage. And I know it's what we say we can afford, but really, if we're about gender equity and we're about parity of pay and we're about empowering women, we have to be asking for all of our staff to be making a living wage and getting good benefits. And if you aren't challenged to put that into the budget and put it out there, I can guarantee you it will never happen. I have a saying that all of my clients know. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. And if you don't put it out there to your donors and say, look, we have to increase our budget by $200,000 a year so that all of my staff have the kind of salary and benefits they need to survive, then how are they going to respect you when you're talking about equal pay for women and economic empowerment for survivors if we're crippling our own staff? So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I am going to say you need to be making arguments like that. It won't make donors think less of you because you're asking for more money. It'll actually stay on brand with your mission and move your organization forward and be more respected. So once you have your budget, the next thing you have to do is focus on your outcomes. And this is an area that I really struggle with domestic violence organizations, because every year I see them produce these reports and it says, we have our 2021 impact report. And it's not an impact report. I want to talk to you for a moment about the difference between impact, outcomes, and outputs. Because when we talk to domestic violence programs across the United States and the territories, what we found was that 78% communicate in outputs, not in outcomes. But 90% of donors say they want to see outcomes. So right there, if you can switch the way that you're communicating and the way that you're talking about your success from outputs to outcomes, you can start to be more in line with what donors are looking for. And if you're going to continue to say that outputs actually have impact, donors are going to start to tune you out. Mackenzie Scott did not give organizations tens of millions of dollars because they had outputs. She said that she did it because of their history of outcomes. Now, I cannot stress this enough. A lot of people don't understand what the difference is between an output and outcome and an ROI. So I'm going to just take a moment to try to explain this so that you can understand why this is so critically important. And I'll take just a moment to say, when I do this with my clients, when I have them step back and actually start to tell the story of outcome, sometimes I'll just have them put together a little 2 or 3 page report and hand it out to all their major donors. And you will actually see the donor's face just like light up, their shoulders drop. And just like, and I've had them say, I am so thrilled to see this because I have been waiting for you all to get to this point. They know what outcomes are. You know, you're dealing with business people for the most part, and those business people understand about ROI. So while we can talk the heart story, and I have certainly been one of those people that has gotten out there and said, you know, it's a, we have too many clients to serve. We cannot have a waiting list. We can't tell someone that they have to wait till tomorrow to come into shelter because they could die. And then stood there and expected the donor to give me more money. Instead of saying, when you invest $1 into our organization, we save this community $40. We are a good return on investment. And let me tell you the story of Mary. We still have to use the heart piece, but we have to make sure that we're also telling the story of impact and outcome in a way that helps business people understand that they're investing their money in change. And that's what they want. They want to see something happen. So inputs are things that we push into the system. We have no control over them. The number of people who call the hotline, you have no control over that. That's the number of people coming in, the number of intakes that we do. And perhaps it's the number of people who are ordered to BIP if you do a batter's intervention program. Those are all inputs. What we do with those inputs is we put them through our programs. We give them services. We might have safety plans or nights in shelter or number of people in shelter or a number of abusers completing a course. Now, the thing about outputs, which 78% of you report and call impact, is that they aren't impact. All these are widgets. They say we did something. We provided a service. But it doesn't tell me whether that service did anything to change the outcome of that person's life. If someone got a safety plan, did it help them? Did they leave safely? Were they able to go without injury? Did we avert a homicide? When someone comes into shelter, did you know that the latest research study, which is actually quite old, but that tells you something about research in domestic violence and outcomes, the latest research study shows that 75% of women who go into an emergency shelter return to their abuser or end up homeless. That means only 25% of survivors are we successful with. And that's really, really sad. That's an outcome that we should all be really committed to changing. But we don't track those numbers. We have to, because donors insist upon it. It's why we get 0.2% of the philanthropy. All we talk about are outputs. We don't talk about how many people got housed, how many injuries were averted, how many abusers went through our program and did not get reoffend. Better yet, rarely do I see an organization talk about saving dollars because someone's no longer homeless, the dollars that they save from preventing those injuries or decreasing the legal system's costs. You can, and we've created a template to be able to do that. It's free for download on our website. But rarely do organizations take the time to talk about outcomes and outputs. It is critical that you do this and you do it now, because the longer you continue to talk about outputs, the more you're going to tell your donors that what you are doing is just spinning the wheel and not having any sort of impact on the community, and they will pass you by. So once you have your outcomes, you have your plan, you've got your budget in place, do you have the right team? So you have to have the right team to execute this. And one of the things, again, going back to Mackenzie Scott and a lot of other philanthropists, the Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors, lots of people will tell you this. They want to make sure that they are investing in the team. And first and foremost, they're going to invest in the executive director, CEO. That person, they have to have the confidence that this is the leader who can take it to the next level. And if that leader leaves, what will happen? So there must be a succession plan in place. They also want to know that if you don't currently have enough staff, What's your plan in place to get the staff? The worst thing is to say, okay, we're going to build this new shelter and double our number of bed space, but you haven't done a plan for how you're going to pay to staff that. And having gone from 52 beds to 150 beds, I can tell you it doesn't take 3 times the staff, it takes 4 times the staff to manage that sort of operation. So how are you going to do that? They want to know that you have the right people on the right seats. And the other piece is, do you have the right staff to fundraise? Domestic violence organizations say they have less than 1 person on average fundraising. That's not enough. If you're going to do a major gifts program, more than likely it's going to fall to the executive director to do the asks, or you're going to have to get someone who's comfortable making that ask. It's not a simple process, and it's not something that's intuitive. And guess what? Special events people are not really great at asking. Some of them are, but the vast majority aren't. Most of the time, we make the mistake, we hire somebody who is really a community relations person. They're great about going out and meeting everyone and getting to know them and getting them to love the organization, but they can't close the sale. That's what you need. You need a closer. And who is your closer? So once you've figured out your team, you have to also think about your board. They're going to be really important. They may or may not be door openers. If you've got somebody on your board that it just really is against your plan, it's time to maybe help them move on so everybody is behind the plan, willing to donate, and really ready to go. But who's going to open the doors to those major donors? First, we have to figure out who the donors are. Then we have to make sure we can connect to them. So the number one reason that feasibility studies fail is because there aren't enough cultivated donors. Very few organizations said they had enough cultivated donors. In fact, 75% said, no, we do not have enough cultivated donors. We don't know where to go to get them. We don't even know how to approach them. And the fundraising strategies typically show that. I mean, how many of you invited people to fundraising events and then really never followed up with those people to cultivate them and try to move them up the pipeline? And I bet most of you don't have a stratified fundraising strategy so that you're communicating different things to different donors based on the amount of money that they can give. So where do I get cultivated donors? Well, I don't know if you've ever seen this. I didn't create it, but it's a really great tool for nonprofits to be able to take a look at where do we start. Well, the first people you start with, it might seem silly, but it's your board. The first ask you always make in a capital campaign or any major gifts campaign is your board of directors. Those are the people who are your inner circle, and you have to look there first. As a consultant, almost everybody comes to me and says, help us find new donors. Well, your new donors are going to be the people inside first. We have to get them on board because everybody else is going to be looking to see that they made a major gift first. If the people in your inner circle aren't willing to give, if they're not willing to give at the level that other people know that they can give, they're not going to give either. And your senior staff, if they're paid well enough, should also be making a gift, even if it's $10 or $20, whatever they can afford. Being able to say that your senior staff is on board is also really important. Then you go to your major donors. Again, if your board won't give, that's a red flag. In fact, I had a client that when I did a wealth screen on her board, we found that they could actually give collectively $1 million to her campaign. And yet most of them weren't giving anywhere near what that we knew that they could give. So we asked them, and you know what they said? I don't know where my go. You don't have a plan in place. You know, I'm not really sure about the outcomes of the organization. So that's when I was able to convince the executive director that we needed to step back and put those pieces in place. And now their fundraising has grown exponentially. In fact, when we put those pieces in place, most of my clients see double-digit increases in their fundraising in the first year. And I'm not really making it serious. It really happens. It's that simple. Not rocket science. Next, you go to your volunteers, your employees, and your annual fund. A lot of people think, oh, my volunteers, they just donate so much of their time, I don't want to bother them with a fundraising ask. But they're actually a great source of revenue. And many times, the only reason they haven't given is because you haven't asked them. And again, I can't emphasize enough, we use iWave, but there are lots of tools out there. Using that wealth engine screen to know exactly how much they might be able to give is critical. You never, ever, ever go into an ask not knowing exactly how much money you want to ask for. So having that information can really make your job a whole lot easier. And you'll see in the next step why. Then we look at former clients and then people with similar interests. When I was a CEO, we did a study and found that 80% of our donors were survivors or family members of survivors. They had an interest in our organization and they had an affinity and a passion for the mission. What we had to do is to communicate to them why giving to us would make an impact that would have maybe helped them or someone like them in the future. Then you go to your general universe. I can't tell you how many times I've had nonprofits come to me and ask me if I would write grants for them to foundations that they really don't have any affinity to at all. And maybe they give to human services or something, but they haven't started on the inner portion of the work and moved their way out. So just remember, when you're thinking about where do I find the donors, start with your inner circle. And if you haven't taken the time to figure out what those giving levels are and who we can go and ask, don't start going to that outer circle until you started from the inside. And next, we're going to talk about how many donors do I need? Well, remember that budget that you did? It's really important when you have that budget that you pull that number together. So if your organization needs $1 million a year for 3 years, your campaign would be a $3 million major gifts campaign. Now, sometimes we even call them capital campaigns, even though they're not for bricks and mortar. But if you're raising money for your operating fund, it's often called a comprehensive campaign. So it's the same process, whether you call it a capital campaign or a comprehensive campaign. It's just that one involves your annual fund money and the other doesn't. So how much do I need and how many donors do I need? Well, this is a gift level chart. So there are a lot of these out on the internet. You can just Google giving level chart and you type in your number and this pops up and it populates based on the amount of money that you need to raise. This is actually $1.28 million. And you can see that 60% of the money that we need to raise is going to be raised by just 4 donors. 4 gifts is going to get us 60% of the way there. That means we need 10 prospects. And so what I tell my clients to do, it's really silly. It's simple. You take an Excel spreadsheet, you put $25,000, you know you need 1 gift, you have 5 little spaces of 5 prospects that you need to start cultivating at the $25,000 level in order to get there. Then I can go back to my board and I can say, who can give $25,000 over 3 years? And we start to populate those names. Before you know it, you've got all 245 of your prospects in that list, and you're starting to look at how do we start to cultivate these individuals? Now, normally for a campaign this size, which is actually fairly small, believe it or not, you'd only really do the cultivation strategy for maybe the 2,500 and up. The 2,000 and below, you might do direct mail campaign, or you might do a online campaign, since direct mail is starting to tank these days. So you wouldn't go out into the public for those smaller gifts until you had raised that first significant amount of money. So that's a really helpful tool when you're starting to go through this process. Now, are you missing any of those components? Well, I want you to pause for a moment and think about that, because if your organization is missing one of the critical 5 components, I have a solution for you. Now, I'm really passionate about domestic violence. I spend a lot of my time working to end violence against women and children. I pass legislation, I work with survivors. I do a lot of pro bono work for organizations around the globe, and it really is my heart work. And so I wanted to develop a product that I could offer to domestic violence organizations that they could afford in this really critical time during COVID. And I know a lot of organizations can't afford to hire my company for $10,000, which is normally what we would charge for a package, to take somebody through and actually work their nonprofit to the point where they were ready for a major gifts campaign. So we decided if we did this in a small group cohort, that we could be really effective with a large number of groups and help them through this process. So this is what we're calling the Mastermind series, and it is specifically designed for organizations that fight to end violence against women. We're going to be launching this in February. It'll be held over the course of 10 weeks. They're going to be actually 6 intensive sessions. I'm personally going to lead them. And after every single session, you are going to get tools and templates that you can use to actually implement every single thing that you'll learn in each session. These are going to be hands-on, roll up your sleeves work. We're going to be putting you through the process. And by the end of 10 weeks, you will have a pitch deck ready to present to a real live philanthropist. And we're so convinced that you're going to be thrilled. I really honestly know that this is going to make a difference in your organization, that if you get through all of the sessions and you are unhappy and you feel like you haven't learned anything and it hasn't made a difference in your fundraising, I'm going to give you your money back. Absolutely. No questions asked, no explanations. I'll just give you your money back, because I know one major gift ask will pay for this tenfold. And I want you to be able to have not only the money you need to serve the survivors, but make sure that the programs that you are having in your organization are having the impact in the community, and that the community can see that and see the value of that. So here's our real life philanthropist. I'm so excited to have her. When I was a CEO, I had to pitch to her many times. Fortunately, she and the board of the Dr. Phillips Charities granted my organizations with millions of dollars and made my life a whole lot easier. But every single time I went up in front of her, I have to say I was terrified. Dr. Ann Manley is amazing. She is one of the most intelligent, brilliant women I've ever met. And she was first a CEO and then spent 25 years as the vice president of grants at the Dr. Phillips Charities, and gave away and oversaw giving away millions of dollars every single year. That has made a tremendous impact. But one thing she taught me, and I hope she will teach all of you, is the importance of being prepared and having your outcomes, and being really thorough and knowing that what you are pitching to this philanthropist is going to make a difference. And she will be giving you real-time feedback on your pitch. So every single session, you'll have your templates, your tools. We'll have 2 weeks in between each session. You'll be working on developing your pitch so that once you get through session 6, you get your feedback from Dr. Manley and myself, you will be ready to go out and start pitching in your community and landing those major gifts. So 5 slots available. I can only handle 5 at a time. And because I am so passionate, I know this sounds like a used car sales pitch, but I really am passionate about this. I'm really discounting my time, normally what I charge. And because it's domestic violence and it's so dear and dear to my heart, sexual violence is also open to this sessions. 2 people in your organization can attend the Mastermind series, all 6 sessions, $1,250. We won't do this price again, but and again, money back guarantee. If you make it through all the sessions and you're not satisfied, we will refund your money. So there's absolutely nothing you can lose by doing this. We hope you'll join us. I'm excited to see you in the Mastermind series. If you have any other questions or you want to sign up, please visit our website here. It's info.charityglobal.com/mastermind or DV-mastermind workshop. We'll be sending that link out to a lot of folks and putting it out on our social media if you miss it. Or you can email me if you have questions at carol.wick@charityglobal.com. Think about this. Your first major gift ask, if $1,000 is a major gift, could be to pay for this. Trust me, investors want you to succeed. and we want you to succeed. So I'm looking forward to having my first mastermind class, 10 DV organizations, and really helping you ramp up your major gifts program in 2021. Thank you.